Ladies and gentlemen, let's play gaming.com video. Let's discuss backwards compatibility, shall we, for the next generation systems. There's also an article which you can go ahead and check out. It's linked in the video description if you prefer a written version of this, since we're going to be discussing and referencing many different things. Sometimes people like a written version so they can, read back certain things or maybe reference certain things. But anyway, I digress. So of course Microsoft dropped an absolute bombshell at E3 2015 when they announced the fact that the Xbox One would indeed be capable of running Xbox 360 code, in other words games, and in fact it's going to be emulating it. So we're going to be discussing that because, to be honest, I was one of the naysayers. I really didn't think Microsoft was going to be able to do this. In fact, even they admitted that they didn't think they were going to be able to do this. Sony was shocked as well. Sony were like, okay. Didn't expect that one coming. Not that I blame them. I mean, no matter what you say about Microsoft, I really like the company, but holy crap, that was an impressive feat. And we're going to be discussing that in this video. So, Microsoft obviously have that working, but Sony have stated that although they were surprised by it, they don't think it's right for the system, and they also think it's going to be very difficult for the PS4 to emulate the PS3. Most likely, at least according to Shuhai, this is down to the PS3's architecture. Now, the PS3's architecture is actually quite different to that of the Xbox 360's. We've discussed the PS3's cell processor in depth a couple of times previously. It will be linked, an article for the PS3's cell processor breakdown will be linked in this article I'm putting out, along with a couple of other links which may be pertinent, but I will be blasting through it real quick. So, the major primary differences between the PS3 and Xbox 360, will start with the PS3's cell processor. The first is the cell runs with a PPE, power processing element. Now this is very similar to a traditional power CPU core. The core handles 2 hardware threads and runs at 3.2 GHz. Now, the PPE is actually the basis of the CPU inside the Xbox 360, known as the Xenon, but we'll go more into that in a moment. Now, the PS3's cell processor, and the primary reason that Sony is stating it's going to be quite difficult for Sony to actually emulate this on the PS4, is because of SPUs, Synergistic Processing Units. Now, SPUs, sometimes known as SPEs, or Synergistic Processing Elements, one of those is disabled. This is most likely down due to yields, so that leaves 7 functional units. They are running at the same frequency as the main core, so that's 3.2 GHz, and each of those has its own storage of 256 kilobytes, so in other words, its own cache, if you will. So, effectively speaking, each of the SPEs are independent, but they are told what to do by the main cores. So in other words, the main core will be like, okay, I'm going to delegate this to you or that to you. In other words, it will tell it what jobs to perform. Those jobs are numerous, and I've heard I've heard this actually being called compute before compute was invented for consoles. That's not verbatim quote, but it's accurate enough, and it kind of is accurate. The SPU back in the day used to do numerous things. Anti-aliasing, graphics tasks were a couple of things, but it also used to handle memory management, allocation, AI, physics, and pretty much anything else you can imagine. It used to do numerous things. The PS3's architecture was quite simple. The Xbox 360's architecture was a bit simpler. It had the Xenon cores, which I've mentioned, which are PowerPC. We will be going more into that in just a moment. But there, basically, it had 3 of these cores, meaning 6 total. So, effectively, it was a lot simpler. It's not to say that it was, a bad processor. It's just a lot simpler. And so, technically, its peak performance was a little lower. Each of the SPUs, incidentally, just for your FYI, had a peak workload of about 25.6 GFLOPs, which was really impressive for the time. It did mean that GFLOP-wise, the PS3 actually had more performance than the Xbox 360's, just for your information. But the 360's GPU was slightly faster. So with all of that said, one can take a look at the PS4's CPU or the Xbox 360 CPU and say, well, the Xbox One's processor runs at 1.75 GHz, and obviously that's roughly twice the speed, half the speed of the PS3's processor, which, as we just said a couple of times over now, is running at 3.2. But as we all know, clock speed is not the be-all, end-all, and the last word on performance. There are a multitude of different factors which go into processing performance. One of those, of course, is efficiencies, core amount of instructions it can handle per clock, and so on. Now, for example, the Jaguar has much better branch prediction, and is also an out-of-order processor. This basically means that with branch prediction, it's better at figuring out what route an application is going to take, which is very important for things such as physics, for things such as artificial intelligence, for things, well, pretty much anything actually in programming. Most of the time you're either doing loops or if statements or what have you. In other words, it's like, will this run A, or will this run B, or will this run C, or is it going to just go to a different scenario? This is very important because then the processor can become somewhat preemptive and start drawing information into the system and start pipelining it, maybe running on a different core or what have you. Furthermore, and this one's actually a bit of an assumption on my part, I'm basing this on guesses, not basing this necessarily on what Microsoft have said, as they are being cagey, I guess you could say, with their information. But I think some of it is down to some of the unique components in the Xbox One. Now, by unique components, I mean things such as the audio processors, the GPU. Not that the GPU on the Xbox One's unique, it's GCN based, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But the shape processor, for example, I've heard information which is basically that the Xbox 360's audio used to pummel the CPU something rotten. Obviously it does depend on the game, but in extreme cases it could take like an entire hardware thread just for the audio. So when we start doing the mathematics on that, and you consider that the shape processor in the Xbox One is actually pretty robust, it basically handles most of that itself, one can start seeing how that's actually offloading quite a lot of work from the processor. Which makes some sense. Obviously, we all know by now there's 6 cores on the Jaguar, which is inside the system. 7 if one assumes you're not going to utilize Kinect. I'm going to assume, for the purpose of this video, that it's most likely that 7th core is being utilized by the Xbox 360 or Xbox 360 emulator. The reason I'm guessing that is because it wouldn't really make sense for it not to, given the other applications and just the way the system's running. It just wouldn't make sense, because it's not like they need voice commands or what have you. Anyway, getting back into the gist of things, what we know is that Microsoft have said that they built a virtual 360 entirely in software, and then we take old 360 games and put them in through the emulator and run them through the emulator. Effectively speaking, the team, and this is what Spencer said, the team took the approach of effectively running the whole hardware OS that was running on the 360 hardware on the Xbox One. So you boot games, it literally boots up the operating system on the 360. This is why you can play live and everything else. That was the most difficult thing. Now, software-based PowerPC emulation has been around for some time. One could take a look by googling PowerPC, Pear PC, that's Pear PC, which is an emulation project that was released way back about 11 years ago, mid-2004. It's capable of running multiple different Power-based OSs and applications, including pre-Intel Mac OS X's. Remember, back in the day, it used to be Power architecture, and then Apple made the decision I would say a surprising decision to some degree to say, actually, nah, we're going to be switching to Intel. And a lot of people were surprised by that. And some people were actually pissed. Some Intel fans, some Apple fans were actually kind of pissed at that because they felt that they were going with a more inefficient architecture. But that's somewhat out of the remit for this video. Anyway, the emulator pretty much runs a just-in-time compilation. What that means is, let's say you've got a regular exe, it's already pre-compiled with using x86 source. So let's say you download an application, let's say you download Firefox, just for the sake of argument, or you download a set of drivers, or whatever the hell you're downloading, it doesn't really matter. When you're downloading that, you'll notice that typically you'll find like a source, or you'll find pre-compiled, basically like an exe. Now, you can compile the source yourself. This is getting very into programming, and I don't want to make this super complex, so I'm going to make this fairly simplistic. But you can basically download a pre-compiled iteration of the program, which would be compiled based on your operating system. That's not to say necessarily that if something's written for x86 or PowerPC, you can just simply compile it, and that's it. You know, there are some complexities and definitely tweaking you need to do, but effectively. Now, what that basically means with just-in-time is that it's executing, and while the application's executing, it will be converted from PowerPC to x86. So effectively it's emulating it. You could think of this a little bit like a Genesis emulator or a SNES emulator. It's basically mirroring the functionality. And once again, I'm simplifying this quite a bit, but I don't want to make this, a computer science lesson. It's pretty much where I'm going with my thoughts and opinions on that one. So what about the GPU side of things? Well, the Xenos, that's Z. Well done spelling. Well done, brain. You're in a top condition today. That's Xenos. That was the GPU inside the Xbox 360. Now, the GPU inside the Xbox 360 has some differences, mostly in terms of a very long word, which you know what? I'm doing the complex thing, aren't I? Anyway, basically, the main differences back in the day is AMD's GPUs were built with a long... God damn it, what's that acronym? A very long instruction word. That's the one I was looking for. God damn, so many acronyms. And basically, they switched to a more SIMD architecture, which is single instruction, multi-data. It basically means it's more towards parallelism and compute, which is obviously what we know AMD have been really pushing towards and what the next generation consoles have been utilizing heavily. Effectively speaking, however, at the very core fundamentals, the GPU is still capable, and I refer to Xbox Ones, is still more than capable of running DirectX 9, which is what the Xbox 360 ran, effectively. It was a derivative of DirectX 9. There were some slight differences, obviously, consolitis. In other words, it was effectively a lower level DirectX 9 and also a lighter version of DirectX 9, so that you didn't have to concern yourself so much with so much overhead. But effectively, that's what it was. Anywho, I'm going to also make an assumption, and this is an assumption that Microsoft are probably never going to tell us, but it's an assumption that I think sounds fairly plausible. I will probably guess that some of the work has also been farmed out to the GPU in terms of compute functionality. I'm not 100% sure what, but it would probably make some sense that some stuff was farmed out to the Xbox 360's, Xbox One's GPU for compute. It would make some sense. Now, the memory architecture between the two systems is also quite similar. There are obviously some differences, but effectively still... Why is it me in the word effectively today? That's most annoying. But anyway, the architecture is very similar. They're still utilising unified memory, which is the PS3 wasn't, incidentally. It was using 2 buckets, if you will. One for the GPU, 256 megs. One for system, which is 256 megs. I'm going to ignore, for the sake of my sanity, I'm going to ignore system reserved memory, because obviously there was system reserved memory for the Xbox 360, for the Xbox One, for the PS4, for the PS... I'm just going to ignore that. So, you know, just for the sake of this debate, or, you know, my thoughts and opinions, that doesn't exist. So you can just kind of add that in yourself if you want. So what that basically means, for those who don't know what unified memory is, and you probably do, but it means that, let's say Xbox 360 has 512 megabytes of memory, which it does. A developer could say, hey, there's 112 megabytes of game code and 400 megabytes goes towards textures. Or you can have another developer that's got 256 megabytes of game code and 128 megabytes of graphics assets and 128 megabytes of sound assets. Or you can have another developer that's got 256 megabytes of sound assets. You get the idea. Anyway, the basic premise, if you've got unified memory, a developer is more free to create a game without needing to worry about how you've set the system up. Because, let's face it, if you're running a console, you've got set hardware. In other words, you can't go in and add in additional memory. Yes, I know you can with, like, I don't know, the Saturn, for example, but generally, and with these generation of systems, you can't. So, what you've got to do is say, hey, to the developer, we don't know what games you're going to create. We just don't. You know, you might have one game which is going to be primarily audio, or you're going to have another game which is very little assets in terms of AI. There might not be much AI. There might not be much scripting going on. There might not be much physics. Or there might be one game with an absolutely ridiculous amount of physics and a ridiculous amount of code, but the graphics are quite simplistic, or what have you. You just don't know what they're going to do. So what their idea is that it would be better to just have a unified. Now, with a PC, that's a bit different, because if you've got 4 gigs of RAM and a game requires 8 gigs of RAM, well, guess what? You're just going to have to open up your system and add in the extra memory. But as I said, you can't do that with a console. So Microsoft decided to go with unified. Obviously, the PS4 is also unified. It's using GDDR5, just for your FYI. Anyway. So, in terms of memory, it wouldn't be too bad. They basically can just have a large but anyway, a large space which is segmented just for the emulation of the Xbox 360's system, and then obviously they can just put in whatever they need, all the game's assets into that, which kind of makes sense because once again they've only got 512 megabytes to worry about, which isn't too big in terms of a block of memory. It's not that much memory to reserve, considering the Xbox One has 8 gigs. Obviously, that isn't taking into account, once again, the system reserves, but let's say you've even got about 5.5 gigs remaining of system reserves. Once that's taken out, you've still got 5 gigs. It's not bad, right? So that's my thoughts and opinions on it. I personally believe, and this is off the technical topic, Microsoft got a really large round of applause. I don't think anyone is going to dispute that. But I do believe that if this had happened, let's say 6 months ago, 12 months ago, I think it would have been a lot different. If the system had launched with emulation, it would have been incredible. I believe it probably would have changed the fate of the systems, at least initially. I'm not saying that the PS3 would have, the Xbox 360 would have meant a super smooth transition to the Xbox One, in terms of, you know, people who are just like, oh, I'm definitely going to buy a Xbox One over the PS4 because it's got backwards compatibility. But I do feel, especially early on in the first like 12 months, when there's not that many games on the ground and you think, well, I don't mind selling my old system to buy another console if I've got, you know, next generation, if I can play next gen games and old games. What I'm basically saying is that if this had appeared like 6 months ago, let's say Christmas-ish, or certainly middle of last year, if this had been announced last E3, I think it would have made quite a splash. And I think it probably would have meant quite a surge in Xbox One sales, at least initially. Anyway, once again, this is some speculation because Microsoft have not released the information on exactly what happens here. There is a lot of speculation, and I'm basing this on some solid evidence. And obviously, you know, I'm not saying that a unicorn powers it. Maybe a unicorn does power it. How am I to know? But hopefully you've enjoyed it. It is a bit of a thought process, a bit of a thought exercise, if you will. But for now, I'm going to get going. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.